Today's video is about feedback. Why feedback? Because you need feedback in most audio amplifiers to reduce distortion, extend frequency response, and lower noise. It's necessary. But large values of feedback, well, that's open for debate. Some people think it squashes dynamics, compresses the sound, and generally robs the audio of life itself. So let's go over that and see if that's true or not and how you feel about those statements. So what we have here is an audio tube amplifier. It is a push-pull amplifier. Essentially, feedback means that the output of the amplifier is fed into the input. The two waveforms are flipped from each other, positive, negative. Then they are compared. The output is then compared to the input. The input's obviously more pristine since it hasn't been amplified yet. And then the feedback is applied, however many decibels of feedback is necessary to flatten the distortion, linearize the frequency response, and decrease the amount of noise. The higher the amount of feedback applied, the less amplification there is. So if you apply, say, a little bit of feedback, the amplification isn't reduced all that much. If you apply large amounts of feedback, it's reduced quite a bit. Tube amplifiers are the most linear devices ever made. They have the least amount of feedback necessary to keep them low in distortion. And if we move up the classes, as you could say, to transistor amplifiers, bipolar, and MOSFET, and then the most feedback is applied to Class D or digital amplifiers. Vacuum tubes. As I discussed before, the most linear devices ever invented for amplification. Not much different than a light bulb, as a matter of fact. They only have very few component parts. Because of the way the cathode emits electrons, it just jumps across to modulate the signal. There's nothing in between. There's no funny business going on. You can run these tubes without any type of feedback. People use a little bit, usually 0 to 6 decibels of feedback in single-ended circuits and a little more than that for push-pull. We'll talk about push-pull in just a moment. This is the push-pull tube amplifier. Why is it called push-pull? Because these tubes hand off and do the amplification duty. One hands off at the positive phase, one hands off at the negative phase of the audio waveform. They are able to combine their power thusly. The downside is there's a bit of distortion when they hand off to each other. It's not perfect, so we apply a little bit of feedback. The feedback comes from the output terminals to the input of the input tubes. They're combined. One's reversed, one's in positive, one's in negative form. Helps to cancel out the distortion. With that, there's a little bit of harmonics being generated, mostly second order. With that said, the distortion tends to cancel that out. It's not a lot of feedback, so we have mostly intact dynamics, and the output wattage, not wattage, but amplification is reduced a little bit by the amount of feedback. So generally, if you had 6 dBs of feedback, you lose 6 dBs of amplification. But that's how a push-pull amplifier works. On to the transistors. Let's move on to transistors, shall we? This is kind of an old school transistor amplifier, still considered to be a pretty nice amp. Some people say it was designed by Nelson Pass. Who really knows? There's all kinds of opinions based on that. Considered a pretty good amplifier in its day, and it still is. It uses bipolar transistors for amplification. They require a moderate amount of feedback. From there, they moved on to MOSFETs, and we'll discuss that in just a moment. But this uses quite a bit of feedback. It does sound pretty good. And now that we're on transistors, let's talk about why they were invented in the first place. They were invented because, as you know, tubes are hot, tubes are large, tubes have a limited lifespan, but are transistors superior in audio performance? No, they're not. They have higher levels of distortion, they're not as linear, and they produce more third and higher order harmonics than tubes do. Tubes, even when they're distorting, have a second order harmonics. A lot of that Led Zeppelin crunch you hear, or some of the vintage rock where it's distorted, would be unfathomable with the transistor amplifier, because the distortion would drive you right out of the room. So with that said, bipolar transistors were invented for convenience. These are the little darlings of the audio world. These are Class D, or digital amplifiers. It used to be the Class D was only used in subwoofers because they required large amount of wattage and low heat production. So with that said, they're now used in full range amplifiers. They say that that's because they have better transistors in them, better circuitry, better filtering. So essentially, Class D works by using a switching source. It switches the transistor off and on very, very rapidly, kind of stuttering its way through the music at sometimes 300 kilohertz. That is filtered out at the end, leaving the audio waveform somewhat intact. People rave about their lower power consumption, their high audio wattage output. They're cool, they're small, but unfortunately, in my opinion, there's a price to pay for that. That is in distortion products that are not necessarily measurable, but they are audible. There's a compression that occurs because the audio waveform is kind of squashed, and the more feedback you add to an amplifier, the more you rob it of its life in the audio world. So that's my feeling about that. Are they true high fidelity objects for amplification? I don't think so. I don't use them. I'm a tube kind of guy, you probably noticed. So that's the take on feedback. These have the most feedback of any audio device that I've come across. So take her to leave it. Class D is probably here to stay because they're inexpensive, but you pay your money, you take your chances.